This is the poll of polls, Chris. This is one that the markets believe more than anything else because it's wider. What's the margin of error?
Yeah, I think that it is generally a bit more believed than other polls. Firstly, because the sample size is a lot larger. We interviewed over 100,000 people in the past 7 days, but also because it was one of the things that was indicating we were heading towards a hung parliament in 2017 when all of the rest of the polls didn't. However, just like all other polls, it does have a margin of error, and that's really crucial with the data that we put out last night, because whilst the central estimate is a Conservative majority of around 28 seats, at this stage we don't feel like we can rule out a hung parliament because of that margin of error.
Do you have any indication of why the gap actually narrowed between Labour and Conservatives?
Honestly, we don't really have a good indication of that. The gap seemed to close for sort of a mix of things. It was voters moving in lots of different directions, Labour gaining a few votes off the Tories, a few more votes off the Lib Dems. There wasn't a clear pattern to it, but the data does show that the gap did start to close, particularly since the weekend, potentially off the back of the bad day that Boris Johnson had on Monday, and therefore that caused the number of Conservative seats that we're estimating to come down. We're also seeing a small increase in tactical voting amongst Remain voters, and that's causing even more problems for the Conservatives.
Okay, we're also voting in December. We haven't done that in the UK since the 1920s. Are you worried about that, and how many people are still undecided about who they'll vote for tomorrow?
I am. Turnout is something that polls really struggle with, and it is a potential cause of inaccuracy. It's one of the things that we have to hold our hands up and go, look, we're not ever going to get perfect. We don't know what effect the winter weather's going to have. We haven't had an election in December in the UK in the best part of a century. Our best estimate, though, is that turnout is going to stay roughly the same as it did last time round. That's the kind of numbers we're working to. Actually, yes, you do have the wintry weather, the cold weather, but obviously we have a lot of postal voters here in the UK, so many people who might be put off by the weather have already voted. And the other thing to consider as well is that close elections and elections where there's perceived to be a big difference between the two parties are also the kind of elections where we see high levels of turnout, so maybe that will counteract the effect of any weather effects.
So how many people undecided? One in five? And do they make up their mind at the last minute, or is there a chance that they don't go and vote?
We have seen a big drop-off in undecided voters over the past week, so it's sitting it's a bit below 1 in 5, and most people that are saying undecided at this stage generally end up not going out to vote anyway, so we'd say most voters have made up their mind. There does still seem to be a chunk of Labour voters who voted Leave in the EU referendum who are still making up their minds, and I think it'll be interesting to know where they end up going on election day.
When you look at the tactical voting, does it really make a difference more in this election than last time around?
I think it's probably going to have more of an effect in this election than it ever has done before. What we're seeing in the data is a chunk of what we're calling motivated Remainers. These are people who no longer necessarily have a sort of tribal loyalty towards a particular political party, but they have quite a lot of loyalty and support for their referendum position and Remain and staying in the European Union. Moreover, when you look at the data, they tend to be the kind of people who are more interested in politics, and that's important because one of the barriers to tactical voting hasn't just been a willingness to do it, but it's been that it takes quite a lot to go out and find the information you need in order to do it. So the fact that these are the kind of people who would be willing and able to go and do that, I think means we're likely to see higher levels of tactical voting on that Remain side in this election.
Chris, why did you not do a poll today? Is it just too early, or does it just not shift that much?
We just decided that last night was going to be the final data that we put out. So we did one MRP 2 weeks ago, and then we did one MRP, which the final data for that was 6 a.m. yesterday morning, and then we put it out at 10 o'clock last night.
When you look at the personalities involved, do you think it's more difficult because there's like a number of things that people are voting on? We were discussing it 10 days ago when you came in. This is personality. It's Jeremy Corbyn. It's Boris Johnson. Maybe bigger personalities than in the past. And then you have the confluence of Brexit and spending. Like, there's a lot to go at.
There is a lot going on, and I think this is a very complicated election to try and understand. And I think that's one of the reasons why I can't really give you a good answer on why the gap's closed in the final days. When we do look at the underlying data, they started off this campaign with a big difference between Jeremy Corbyn and Boris Johnson in terms of popularity. Actually, over the course of the campaign, Boris Johnson's popularity has gone down slightly, but gone down, whereas Jeremy Corbyn's has tended to go up and increase. So that gap has closed. Boris Johnson's still more popular, but that gap is smaller than it used to be.
What about the Lib Dems? I mean, they did so well in the European elections, and we've kind of gone nowhere.
Yeah, I think if there's anyone who's had a bad campaign, it'd have to be the Liberal Democrats. They started off going into this election campaign fully full of optimism off the back of the European Parliament elections earlier this year. They faced many difficulties. Firstly, on Remain, they sort of held this position of revoking Article 50, but Labour sort of moved into their space by saying that they're going to offer a referendum. We've also seen that Jo Swinson hasn't landed particularly well with the public, and she isn't necessarily that popular, which has caused us some difficulties.